Hi, and welcome to Generative AI and the Delivery of Legal Services. I'm your Professor Tom Martin, and today we're going to talk about the context of generative AI. First, why study it? Second, what is generative AI? Mindset is everything, and lastly, we're going to talk about some insights about adoption. So why study generative AI? I would argue it's extremely useful, and you've probably had a lot of experience with it to date. And so we're going to go into some of the legal use cases of generative AI, and there's many. From document drafting and summarization, it does a fantastic job of that. Why not? It's a large language model. It understands language, and we as lawyers are experts at that. So the two go hand in hand. It can help with client screening, taking in a number of answers to questions and then analyzing that. Predictive analytics, taking past cases, judicial rulings, and then predicting the outcome of a new case. 24/7 legal chatbots. They can be imbued with the knowledge of frequently asked questions and then answer questions on the fly when lawyers are not available to answer them. Legal research. AI can take a case, it can analyze it and brief it and break it down so that it's easy to understand and digest. E-discovery, poring over thousands of documents and finding common patterns and analytics within those documents. Contract analysis, you could feed a playbook, which is a standard way of identifying specific legal issues within a contract, and then even suggest drafting changes, revisions to the lawyer. But there's also other use cases beyond legal. Brainstorming ideas, it eliminates having to face a blank page and not knowing where to start. Checking grammar, helping as a writing assistant, summarization, translation. You can translate things on the fly, so that's much less a barrier to speaking globally. Factual research. The old-fashioned way is you go on Google, you perform a dozen different searches, and then you have to aggregate that information together and synthesize it. But with an AI tool like Perplexity, you just feed it in what you want to research, and it does all of that aggregation and synthesis for you and provides a number of citations so you can make sure to double check that it is accurate. Lastly, emotional support. Not a bad use for ChatGPT. You can have somebody to talk to when someone else is not available, or you don't want to have the possibility of feeling judged by what you need to talk about. Some benefits for lawyers of using ChatGPT or other generative AI are the efficiency gains, obviously. That leads to a cost reduction and less effort because, like with e-discovery, you don't have to spend the same amount of time poring over thousands and thousands of documents. Naturally, that leads us to think about our service model and how we bill for things. But actually, by becoming more efficient, we could take on more cases, and we could also deal with more of the strategy and judgment that we bring to the table as lawyers. It can help with making decisions. One of the things that I've found is great with AI is assigning it different roles. So it could role play with you. It could play the role of an impartial jury, an impartial judge, or a devil's advocate, and give you those different points of view to refine your arguments. I would argue it makes lawyers less prone to error because we're all human, we get tired, we might miss an issue, but if you have an AI that is trained on past cases, data, and legal issues, it can help you to spot an issue that you may miss because you've been working too long or too hard. New service delivery models. Like with the legal chatbot, you can have that working for you 24/7, 365 to potentially garner new clients, but also it could be used to ask questions, take in those answers, and draft documents, leading to an additional source of income. And some other benefits are less procrastination. You can get started quickly. It can give you insights into data, requires less effort, efficiency, with a concomitant cost savings, and a better work-life balance, I would argue, would be hopefully the result of all of this, that we get to spend less time working and more time enjoying life. So what is generative AI? Well, before we get there, let's look at the before picture. I think it's always important to understand how things were before. So conditional logic, or traditional computer programming, was a collection and is a collection of if-then statements, if then else. If one condition happens, like in this example, if the client is in state A, then add clause 1. Pretty simple. But then let's add another rule. If the client is in state B and is dealing with issue X, add clause 2. All right, we can handle 2 rules. Third, and you can see it goes on, and that we can stack rule upon rule, and as we know, exception upon exception, and to actually manage that and to provide useful insights, and complexity gets more and more difficult over time. So I think our eyes were opened when we all experienced that ChatGPT moment, when the difficult became simple. A simple user interface where you could simply ask for something and you would get a response. You can talk with it and it would have a conversation with you. I would argue it was a day that the world changed. I know it was for me. It was the first time I ever had an intelligent and fluent conversation with machine. Even though it doesn't think like us, it was pretty convincing and certainly passed the Turing test. And it's crazy to think that that was just over 2 years ago. So to define generative AI, it's a subset of artificial intelligence that's designed to generate content. And it could be in different media. It could be text, as we've seen, audio, video, and images. And so it goes beyond classical AI, which would merely classify and predict, to actually generate content. And so that was the huge differentiator in what opened our eyes with the ChatGPT moment. But I would argue that something that's even more important than the magic that AI could bring to us with its generation of content is how we think about it. Because arguably, mindset is everything. It's going to limit how you use it based upon how you think of it. And so, ways not to think of it. You don't want to think about generative AI as a magical oracle. And this is, I think, this is a pitfall that quite a few people have fallen into. I know that it's the origin of the Schwartz case, for example. That's the ethics case out of New York, where an attorney relied on hallucinated cases and then ultimately got fined by the court for that. It was because the lawyer took what ChatGPT was providing to him for granted, that it was infallible, a magical oracle's dictation, and used that without change. So the mindset can have a very powerful impact on the success you have with using generative AI. But at the same time, it's not as simple as just being a language calculator. Some people have likened generative AI to simply a next word predictor. And I think that really undervalues what it's doing. It's not only predicting the next word. You have to consider everything that came before, which has put it in a position to predict the next word. There's a lot going on under the hood. And so another derisive thing that people have said about generative AI is that it's a stochastic parrot. It's just a random parrot just saying whatever it's memorized or whatever is on its mind according to probabilities, and that there's no logic or rhyme or reason involved. Again, I think that undervalues what's happening here. And to make it really easy to understand, I want to introduce you to Ilya Sutskever. He is the former co-founder of OpenAI, and also he was its chief scientist at the time. And he also undertook some work early on with Geoffrey Hinton with generative adversarial networks. But just listen to him. I think he explains why generative AI is much more than just a next word predictor. Let's listen in.
I'd like to take a small detour and to give an analogy that will hopefully clarify why more accurate prediction of the next word leads to more understanding, real understanding. Let's consider an example. Say you read a detective novel. complicated plot, a storyline, different characters, lots of events, mysteries like clues, it's unclear. Then, let's say that at the last page of the book, the detective has gathered all the clues, gathered all the people, and saying, okay, I'm going to reveal the identity of whoever committed the crime. And that person's name is...
Predict that word.
Predict that word, exactly.
My goodness.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Now.
So as you can see, there's a lot going on under the hood. And that context of everything that proceeded before and having an understanding of it has led some people to remark that generative AI has a worldview, that it understands how different things within our world fit together logically. It may not be the same as how our brains work, but it is getting very close to being able to achieve similar results. So I would argue that the way you should think about AI, the way you should think about ChatGPT and all of the other generative AI tools out there is as a helpful assistant. It's not meant to replace you. It's not meant to take the place of your intelligence, but to supplement it, to be a co-pilot, to be a co-intelligence, as Professor Ethan Mollick points out. You bring it to the table to excel and exceed what you could do on your own. And that's the way you should think of it, not as a replacement, because the replacement idea comes from the wrong mindset of seeing it as an oracle. It's there to aid us, not to replace us. Speaking of which, let's talk about the adoption of generative AI. How has it caught on? Has it? I think so. You know, the time to 1 million customers, 100 million customers, is something that people look at when they try to understand the zeitgeist and how excited people are about different software. So for example, we have a comparison here between Uber, Pinterest, TikTok, ChatGPT. This is the number of months it took to reach 100 million. And so TikTok was the latest, greatest thing at the time, where it surged to 100 million users within 9 months. ChatGPT, as you probably have heard, blew it away by reaching that in 2 months. Now the hype cycle from that amount of excitement, this is, by the way, if you're not familiar with it, the Gartner hype cycle, where they map a very natural phenomenon with how we as human beings react to new exciting technology and how that works through our system. So at first there's a trigger, then it reaches a peak of inflated expectations, which typically, when you introduce the real world limitations of it, leads to the trough of disillusionment. And then once you work through that depression at it not reaching the highest expectations that you had for it, you reach the slope of enlightenment, a better understanding of how it actually works in the real world. And then the plateau of productivity, which is where you've reached a happy medium between your expectations of the technology and what it could actually do for you. If you asked me at the end of last year, maybe around October, I would say that we were squarely in the trough of disillusionment. But I think we are coming out of that. I think that we're leading to the slope of enlightenment, and then in that there's been so much discussion and education about generative AI that people are having a more practical view of it and are going to make better use of it. And the numbers speak for themselves. Clio, which is a software company that makes case management software, they ran a report in 2023, and only 19% of lawyers had used AI in any way. That dramatically changed in 2024. They released in this past October that number had jumped to 79%. So 60% within a year. And so that AI adoption was not everyone voraciously using AI, but it was everyone having some exposure to AI. And that change was dramatic. Wolters Kluwer, in its Future Ready Lawyer Survey, found similar results, where in-house counsel had adopted use of AI by 86% compared to law firms at 76%. So there's an entire spectrum to use, but it does mean that lawyers see value in it, and certainly into whatever job you take next, it will be something that you will use most likely on a daily basis. And this graph I put together just to show that a normal adoption curve that's described in the middle in teal is typically how things go. And so you have innovators jumping on first, followed by early adopters and so on. And it follows a typical bell curve. But the dotted yellow line that you see here is the AI adoption curve. Those numbers from 19% to 76%, that's showing that this is a much higher adoption rate. And so what that means practically is that people who wait by the sidelines, wanting to play it safe and see how things play out, will miss out on a lot of learning and a lot of opportunities that they would otherwise have access to. And so for my blog, I created this cartoon which likened the five stages of AI adoption to the 5 stages of grief that lawyers were working through. First, complete denial that, hey, I can't do this, to anger that it could, to bargaining, maybe you could only do this one thing, to depression and acceptance. I see lawyers working through this even now. And not to make light of it, we did put years and years, and you're putting a lot of time into your studies. And I would argue it's not to waste. It's actually going to make your professional life so much easier than I had it or other generations had it. And in fact, you'll be able to use generative AI to your advantage, and it will be a force multiplier. So to wrap it up, I think we talked about why it's important to study generative AI. It's extremely useful, and there's many legal applications for it. We defined what generative AI is. I hope you took away that mindset is everything, really, when you use it, and that you should think of it as a helpful assistant, not a replacement. And adoption is through the roof. So there's no time like now to learn this. And so I'm really glad that you're here. So I hope we have a great semester together, and we'll be learning about many more subjects as the weeks come. Thank you. See you next time.